Josh Whittaker didn't mind being the last country holdout on Sycamore Lane. The way the world was changing. Fast food instead of feed stores, yoga studios where old barns used to stand. He figured his little ranch would one day stick out like a sore thumb. But he never expected the trouble to come from a woman in pearls with a clipboard and a purse dog that wore booties. It started with a note in his mailbox, folded with surgical precision. "Dear neighbor," it read in stiff, flowery font. "Your fence design is impacting the overall curb appeal of the neighborhood. Kindly consider a modern upgrade to maintain property values. Thank you for understanding. Sycamore Hoa Beautification Subcommittee." Josh rubbed his jaw, squinting at the paper like it might bite him. There was no signature, but he already knew who it was from. Her name was Karen. She'd moved into the freshly built white brick McMansion next door just 2 weeks prior. Since then, she'd already called animal control twice, once because his rooster crowed before 7 a.m., and once because she swore Rocco, his Highland bull, had glared at her threateningly through the fence. Josh remembered how the officer laughed after the second call. "Your bull's got sass, I'll give him that. But he's behind a fence. She's not getting a restraining order on livestock." That was a month ago. Since then, Karen had organized neighborhood trash cleanups, hosted 2 brunches on her lawn with tiny flags in the grass, and passed around pamphlets on how to upgrade your property's facade for community cohesion. The woman never came without a clipboard, and never smiled without showing teeth. But it wasn't until Josh noticed her walking along the edge of his fence one evening, eyeing the posts like a contractor and scribbling notes, that his gut started warning him. That night, Rocco had paced in the barn, slow, stomping circles that kicked up dust. He wasn't agitated. He was alert, watching the shadows like they didn't belong. Josh watched him from the doorway, uneasy. The next morning was when the real trouble began. Josh had driven into town for supplies. Took longer than expected. Tractor battery wouldn't crank, ended up needing a tow. He got back around noon, hot, irritated, and ready to spend the day alone. What he saw made him slam the truck door so hard it bounced back open. 12 feet of his fence were gone. Not fallen. Gone. The posts had been sawed clean, wood dragged aside. The open stretch of field led directly to Karen's backyard, where she stood in yoga pants and wedge sandals, holding head shears like a prize. Her eyes lit up as she noticed him. "Morning," she chirped. "Doesn't it feel so much more open now? You're welcome." Josh didn't reply. His eyes weren't on her. They were scanning the field behind her. The pasture was empty. "Where's Rocco?" he whispered. And somewhere, not far off, a deep guttural snort echoed across the grass. Josh didn't remember jumping the ditch. His boots hit Karen's perfect lawn before his brain caught up. His hands clenched at his sides, but he didn't yell. Yet. His eyes scanned wildly past her, heart pounding like hooves on hardpan. "Where's Rocco?" he demanded. Karen blinked, offended by his tone more than the question. "You mean the ox? I assumed he was inside. Honestly, your whole setup is so outdated." A sudden gust carried a low, echoing huff, the kind you feel more than hear. Josh turned like a bloodhound. Beyond the trimmed hedges and azalea bushes came the sound of something massive moving. Karen turned too, just in time to see the hedgerow split. Rocco emerged, silent and regal, like a mountain deciding it could walk. He was a wall of cinnamon-brown fur and muscle, with horns that curved like grim punctuation. His eyes were calm but fixed, as if sizing up the foreign terrain. Karen didn't scream. Not at first. She took a slow step back, one hand rising as if trying to reason with the 2,000-pound animal approaching her decorative rock garden. I didn't know he was out. Why isn't he tied up?" she stammered. Josh didn't answer. He was already moving, sidestepping across the lawn, trying to intercept without spooking either of them. Rocco's ears flicked. His head dipped slightly. His breathing deepened. Then Karen did the worst possible thing. She ran. She didn't just jog. She bolted like a cartoon, high-pitched shrieks trailing her like smoke. Her shears dropped with a dull thud. Rocco, now intrigued by the motion and noise, gave a short, explosive grunt and began to follow, at first a slow trot, then faster. Josh swore under his breath, "Don't run. You never run." But Karen was already halfway across her lawn, leaping over a stone path and sending garden flamingos flying. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Some opened phones. One man across the street stepped outside, stared, and shouted, "Is that a cow chasing her?" "It's a bull," Josh yelled as he grabbed a rusted feed bucket from the side of his barn and sprinted. Karen zigzagged around a birdbath. Rocco followed, not in rage, just curious and amused, like a predator toying with prey. The earth trembled with each hoofbeat. Karen squealed and dove behind her rose trellis, which cracked like cheap plastic under Rocco's bulk. Josh reached the broken fence line and whistled loud, sharp, and low. "Rocco, come on, big guy." The bull paused, huffed once more, then turned slightly, still tracking Karen, who was now crawling into a kiddie pool in desperation. Josh banged the feed bucket. "Hey, lunchtime." Rocco twitched, torn between chaos and kibble. Josh held his breath. Rocco's massive head swung toward the feed bucket with a soft grunt. Josh's heart raced as he shook the bucket louder, trying to lure the bull back toward the pasture. The tension in the air thickened as Karen's frantic movements only seemed to egg Rocco on. She scrambled in the plastic kiddie pool, her arms flailing as she tried to shield herself from the approaching storm of muscle and hooves. "Rocco, come on," Josh shouted, his voice edged with desperation. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the grass. The bull hesitated, snorting, nostrils flaring as he glanced back at Karen. His large, dark eyes locked onto Josh, a brief moment of connection before the bull's instincts kicked in. Rocco was hungry, but there was something else in his gaze, something dangerous. Josh's pulse quickened. He was running out of time. As Rocco began to take slow, deliberate steps toward the food, Josh's relief was short-lived. He heard it before he saw it, the unmistakable sound of cracking wood. The fence, the one Karen had sliced through with such ease, groaned and snapped under the weight of the bull's advancing steps. Josh spun just in time to see the fence buckle, and then, without warning, crash to the ground. "No," Josh shouted as the bull surged forward, pushing through the newly created gap with terrifying speed. The force of the bull's weight shattered the remaining posts, and Rocco was free. The sound of hooves on hard earth was deafening as the bull tore into the open field, no longer contained by the rickety fence. Josh watched in horror as Rocco turned his attention back to Karen, who had frozen in the pool, her face pale with fear. She wasn't even moving now. She just stared at the beast. But the bull wasn't charging yet. He was taking his time, stepping closer, as if relishing the chase. Josh's mind raced. This was bad. Very bad. Rocco was a gentle giant, but when he was startled or threatened, he didn't know his own strength. "Karen," Josh yelled, his voice tinged with urgency. "Move." But Karen, paralyzed by terror, couldn't react. Her eyes were locked onto Rocco, her hands shaking as she gripped the edges of the pool. The bull's enormous hooves dug into the grass, each step carrying him closer to his prey. The sound was slow, deliberate, the noise of impending disaster. Josh's feet flew across the yard, but the distance was too great. Rocco was nearly on top of Karen, and there was nothing Josh could do but watch as the beast's massive head dipped down. "No, Rocco, stop." Suddenly, Karen's shriek shattered the stillness. She bolted out of the pool, scrambling on her hands and knees, the flimsy plastic snapping under her weight. Rocco, startled by the sudden movement, lunged forward in a blur of motion, and Josh's stomach dropped as Karen sprinted, headlong, right into his path. "Move," Josh shouted, but it was too late. Karen's legs churned in the air as she scrambled, but it was no use. The moment she moved, Rocco followed, He wasn't charging, but the bull was gaining on her, closing the distance with terrifying precision. His giant hooves pounded against the earth, a rhythmic, bone-jarring sound that seemed to sync with her panicked breaths. "Karen, no," Josh shouted from across the yard, watching helplessly as she darted around the corner of her house, cutting across the neatly manicured lawn. But the bull wasn't far behind, his stride effortlessly keeping pace. Karen's sandals flew off her feet as she pushed herself faster, her eyes wide with pure, unadulterated panic. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Rocco's large form looming behind her. His huge, muscular body was like a freight train gaining speed. A shrill scream tore from her throat as she bolted toward the street, the safety of her front door seeming miles away. "I'm going to die," Karen thought, heart hammering. But just as she reached the corner of her yard, she miscalculated. Her foot caught on a sprinkler head, and she tumbled forward in a wild, graceless fall, her body crashing into a decorative rock garden. For a split second, she lay there, dazed and breathless, unable to move. But when she heard the thundering steps behind her, she scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking with exhaustion. There was no time. She had to keep moving. Behind her, Rocco was drawing closer, his nostrils flaring, his massive frame blocking out the sun like a storm cloud. He snorted, his powerful head swinging low, eyeing Karen with strange curiosity. Josh's voice echoed in the distance. "Don't run. Don't run, Karen." But Karen wasn't listening. She wasn't capable of listening. The primal terror had overtaken her mind. Her only thought was to escape. She threw herself over the side of the small retaining wall at the edge of her property, her hands scraping against the rough stone as she climbed up and over, hitting the ground hard on the other side. But that wasn't the worst part. Karen's sprint led her straight into the most ridiculous obstacle she could have possibly imagined. A row of garden gnomes, dozens of them, arranged in a meticulous line, each one standing like a grim sentinel, their beady eyes watching her every move. "No, no, no," Karen screamed as she tripped over the first gnome. It toppled, crashing onto the ground with a loud crack. In an instant, it was chaos. Gnomes flying everywhere, plastic bodies hitting the ground in rapid succession, their faces contorted in weird, grotesque expressions. And Rocco? He didn't flinch. He walked through the falling gnomes, crushing them beneath his hooves with the calm indifference of a bulldozer. Karen's breath came in shallow gasps as she reached the sidewalk, her knees buckling with each step. Rocco was almost there now, his large shadow stretching across her path. Josh, nearly out of breath himself, arrived just in time to see Karen's final misstep. She whipped her head back to check for the bull, but all she saw was his massive body, right on top of her. With one final desperate lunge, Karen ducked behind her rose trellis, frantic, wild, and with no plan left. But even there, the bull's large form loomed, just on the other side. She was cornered. "Please stop. Please, don't," she whimpered, but the bull wasn't listening. Neither was Josh. Josh was nearly out of breath by the time he reached the garden, but the sight before him stopped him in his tracks. Karen was huddled beneath the wreckage of her rose trellis, her hands gripping the splintered wood, her body trembling with fear. Rocco stood just beyond the flimsy structure, his head low, nostrils flaring, and eyes fixed on her like a predator eyeing its prey. He could see it in her face. The terror was real raw. And yet, Josh felt the absurdity of it all creep up on him. This whole mess had started with a few snips of offense, and now it had escalated into a neighborhood spectacle. Rocco had become an unwilling star of a drama neither he nor Karen had ever asked for. The bull wasn't charging, but his patience was wearing thin. With each step he took toward Karen, she recoiled further, pressing herself deeper into the wreckage of her once pristine garden. Josh knew he had seconds, maybe minutes, before Rocco's curiosity turned to aggression. He had to act. Fast. "Rocco, come here, boy," Josh shouted, his voice strained as he tried to be firm without alarming the bull. He held up the feed bucket, but Rocco barely glanced at it. His attention was solely on Karen, and the distance between them was closing quickly. "Karen, you need to move. He's not going to hurt you if you stop running," Josh called, his voice filled with a desperation that even he couldn't fully mask. He wasn't just worried about Karen anymore. Rocco was dangerously close to the edge of what Josh knew to be the bull's unpredictable behavior. Suddenly, Josh's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing a text from his neighbor, Greg. "The cops are on their way." Josh cursed under his breath. He had no idea what kind of mess this was about to become, but he knew it wasn't going to be pretty. The neighbors were likely gathering, phones already out, probably recording the entire spectacle. It was only a matter of time before everyone in the neighborhood knew what had happened. And just as if the universe itself was mocking Josh's current predicament, a police siren wailed in the distance. Josh glanced over his shoulder. 2 patrol cars, lights flashing, were pulling into the street. Great, he thought. This is going to get ugly. "Karen," Josh shouted again, his voice more urgent. "You need to get up and get behind me. Now." But Karen just stared at him, wide-eyed, her body frozen. Her trembling hands had stopped clutching the broken trellis. They were now pressed tightly to her chest. She wasn't listening. Rocco took another step closer, and that was when Josh saw it. The brief flicker of fear in the bull's eyes. His head jerked back slightly, and for a split second, Josh realized the bull wasn't just interested in her. He was responding to her fear, a fear that made Rocco's natural instincts twitch. Before Josh could make another move, Karen did the unthinkable. She screamed. The high-pitched, shrill sound cut through the air like a knife. And in that instant, Rocco's head snapped back, his body coiling like a spring. His deep, guttural snort echoed across the yard, sending Josh's heart into overdrive. "No!" Josh shouted as Karen leaped to her feet and sprinted once again, her legs unsteady but driven by pure terror. In that moment, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Karen's legs pumped furiously, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But Rocco was already moving. And this time, it wasn't out of curiosity. He was charging. Time seemed to stretch, the world around Josh distorting as Karen's frantic sprint pushed her farther into danger. Rocco's hooves pounded the earth with an intensity that shook the ground beneath them. Each step the bull took seemed to quicken as he lunged forward, a blur of power and muscle closing the gap between them. Karen wasn't looking back. Her eyes were fixed on the sidewalk ahead, her body lurching forward in a desperate attempt to escape. But there was no outrunning the sheer speed and agility of Rocco, a bull whose instincts had now been triggered beyond reason. Josh's breath caught in his throat. "Karen," he shouted, but it was no use. She was too far gone, lost in the panic of her own mind. The bull's low, rumbling grunt was all Josh needed to know that there was no time left. He pushed forward, the feed bucket clutched in his hand like a weapon. He needed to stop this before it spiraled completely out of control. And then it happened. In one explosive movement, Rocco surged forward, his hooves churning the earth with brutal force. His massive body cut through the air with terrifying precision, heading straight for Karen, who was still running, her breath ragged and wild. "Karen, get down," Josh yelled, adrenaline coursing through him as he launched himself forward, every instinct screaming to protect her. But Karen didn't hear him. She was too far gone, her legs pumping, her panic-stricken mind focused only on survival. The bull's horns glinted in the afternoon sun, and in the split second that Josh had to act, he saw it. Rocco was going to collide with her. His heart pounded in his chest as he threw the feed bucket to the ground, reaching out with a single desperate motion. His hand wrapped around the back of Karen's jacket, pulling her out of harm's way just in time. Rocco's massive form barreled past them, inches from crushing Karen beneath his weight. For a brief moment, the world seemed to freeze. Rocco's snort echoed in the air, a mix of confusion and frustration. Josh felt his heart in his throat as he yanked Karen toward him. pulling her behind the stone wall of the retaining garden. She was panting, wide-eyed, and trembling, her body shaking in his arms. "Are you okay?" Josh breathed, his voice barely above a whisper, as he held her steady. Her body was stiff with shock, her wide eyes still fixed on the bull, who was now pacing around the yard, restless but not charging. Karen could barely speak. Her voice cracked as she gasped for air. I thought he was going to kill me. He was right there." Josh glanced at the bull, who had stopped a few feet away, his head still low, his breathing heavy. For a moment, it seemed as though Rocco had lost interest, but Josh knew better than to trust it. The bull's eyes were still locked on Karen, his large form coiled with restless energy. "Stay here," Josh ordered, more forcefully than he intended. "I'll get him back in the barn." Before Karen could protest, Josh stepped away, his feet crunching in the grass as he slowly moved toward Rocco, trying to get his attention without startling the animal further. The bull's eyes flicked toward him, and for a brief moment, Josh wondered if he was about to be gored. But then Rocco's gaze shifted again, and Josh's stomach dropped. The moment of calm was over. The bull was charging again. Josh barely had time to react as Rocco rushed toward him, moving faster than he ever thought possible. He only had one chance to stop this. Josh's heart skipped a beat as he watched Rocco's enormous body hurtle toward him. The ground seemed to vibrate with each thunderous step the bull took. Josh's mind screamed this can't happen, but his body was moving on instinct, muscles reacting faster than his brain could process. He dove to the side, just as Rocco's massive horns swept past him in a blur. For a split second, Josh was airborne, his body twisting as the sheer force of the bull's movement sent a gust of wind through his hair. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his shoulder. But he didn't have time to dwell on it. The sound of Rocco's hooves came closer, closer, until Josh knew he was out of time. "Move, you idiot," he yelled at himself as he scrambled to his feet, barely dodging the second rush of Rocco's charge. His hand grazed the ground, pushing himself up, and he sprinted to the left just in time to avoid being flattened. But then came the sound that sent a chill down Josh's spine, the roar of sirens growing louder. The neighbors had clearly called the cops, probably already recording the chaos on their phones, adding fuel to the fire. "What the hell, Karen?" Josh growled under his breath, his eyes darting to the bull now circling the yard, his breathing deep and slow but full of pent-up energy. Rocco paused, his head swinging toward Karen, who was still cowering behind the stone wall. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her face pale with fear, eyes darting between the approaching bull and the sirens now getting closer. Josh's heart clenched. He had to get Rocco out of there before it all went south, before the cops arrived, and this whole mess spiraled even further out of control. But Karen was still frozen. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't even moving. Josh had to make a decision. With one final determined breath, Josh turned back toward Rocco. The bull's massive form loomed just a few feet away, but the gaze in his eyes had changed. He was no longer the docile animal from before. Rocco was ready for something Josh wasn't prepared for. "Rocco, enough," Josh shouted, his voice commanding, firm. He needed to show the bull authority, but every step he took felt like an eternity. The bull snorted in response, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the yard. Josh knew he was getting through to him, but it wasn't enough. Rocco was still too hyped, too wound up. Suddenly, Karen stood up behind the wall, her shaky hands raised as if trying to calm Rocco. "Josh, stop. He won't listen if you keep yelling," she shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the approaching sirens. The bull snorted again, this time louder, more urgent. The ground beneath Josh's feet seemed to tremble with every movement. Karen's voice was now shaky, but there was a hint of something else in her tone, something other than fear. "You have to stop him," she pleaded, her eyes locked on Josh. "Please, you're the only one who can do it." Josh turned to her, eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You're the one who messed with the fence," he barked, but his voice softened when he saw the genuine panic in her face. She wasn't just scared of Rocco. She was scared of what had spiraled out of control. She's right, Josh thought. He was the only one who knew how to handle Rocco. He was the one who'd raised him from a calf. He'd been through worse situations before, but this felt different. The bull, now on high alert, was stepping closer to Karen again, his movements slow but deliberate. Josh had to act. And fast. Josh's mind raced as Rocco moved in, his heavy footsteps reverberating through the yard like a countdown to disaster. Karen stood frozen, her eyes wide and pleading, her hands trembling at her sides. The bull's gaze shifted between Josh and Karen, as though trying to decide who was more of a threat. The sirens blared in the distance, getting closer. There was no more time. The cops would be here any second, and if Rocco was still on the loose when they arrived, the situation could escalate beyond control. Karen's face was pale, her fear almost tangible in the air. "You have to trust me," Josh said, his voice tight, his heart pounding. He was getting through to her, but she was still scared, too scared to move. "What? What do you mean?" Karen stammered, her voice barely audible. She still couldn't seem to pull herself out of the panic. Josh could feel the sweat dripping down his face, his muscles tense as he slowly reached out, trying to maintain eye contact with the bull. He had to control the situation, but it wasn't going to be easy. Rocco took another step forward, his massive body moving like a tank. He wasn't charging yet, but Josh could see the tension in his posture. The bull was getting ready to make another move. "Listen to me," Josh continued, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not going to hurt you. You need to get out of here." Suddenly, without warning, Rocco let out a loud snort, his head jerking toward Karen again. The bull wasn't taking Josh's calm demeanor seriously. Instead, he was focused on the terrified woman in front of him. "No," Josh muttered under his breath. This was it. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. The tension in the air was too thick, and Karen was too close to being trampled by the panicking beast. In a split second, Josh made his decision. He bolted toward the barn, the sound of his boots hitting the grass barely audible over the thundering hooves of Rocco. "Karen, get behind me," he yelled. As if by instinct, Karen snapped out of her stupor. She darted toward Josh, her body moving faster than it had all day. But Rocco was faster. The bull turned on a dime, charging again, his massive frame closing the distance between them at an alarming rate. Josh's breath hitched in his chest. He had to act now. Without thinking, Josh grabbed the rope that hung from the barn post, twirling it around in his hands with expert precision. His plan was reckless, but it was the only one that might work. "Rocco, stop," he shouted, throwing the rope in the air. The bull's attention shifted just long enough for Josh to make his move. He swung the rope expertly, catching it around Rocco's neck in one swift motion. The bull halted, jerking back as the rope tightened, but Josh wasn't done. He pulled hard, using every ounce of strength in his body to control Rocco's movements. The bull fought, thrashing against the tension of the rope, but Josh held firm. "Come on, boy," Josh grunted, his voice steady now. "You've got this." For a long, agonizing moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Rocco tugged once more, his muscles rippling with strength, but Josh stood his ground. Slowly, the bull's movements began to slow. He calmed down, the frantic energy dissipating as Josh took control. Karen stood in awe, watching as Josh wrestled the bull to a standstill. The tension finally began to break. And then, just as the sirens pulled up the street, a voice called out from behind them. "What in God's name is going on here?" It was the HOA president. Of course, Mr. Loring, with his freshly pressed suit and perfect hair, standing at the edge of the driveway, cell phone in hand, recording everything. Joe shook his head, his hand still gripping the rope. "I'll explain later," he muttered. "Rocco, now calm, let out a soft snort, and Josh relaxed, his breath finally coming easy. The bull was under control. Karen, still wide-eyed, turned to him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Josh didn't respond right away. The chaos of the moment was fading, but there was one thing he couldn't forget. "Next time," he said, his voice tinged with a smile, "maybe don't mess with my fence." And just like that, the drama was over. Rocco safely contained, the cops confused, and Josh standing victorious. But as the neighborhood buzzed with questions and excitement, one thing was for sure. The HOA would have a lot to explain in the morning.